honored to be with reenactors from whom I have learned so much. People say, don't judge a man till you've walked a mile in his moccasins, and you are the people who know what it's like to walk in the shoes and sleep on the sheets. I'm from another world, the world of ideas, and I'm going to try to give you some glimpses of ways that people could reflect on their experiences in the 8th century. When Leah invited me, I was delighted because I thought this would be a chance to talk about some themes I've long thought about with Alcuin of York. The events of the last month of watching my country devolve into an evil dictatorship made me think so intensely about Alcuin at the court of Charlemagne watching Northumbria devolve into tyranny and regicide, and Alcuin's decision not to leave, that I realized I did not have the sort of scholarly capacity for distance not to completely sort of intercalate those two events. And so I'm going to give you a slightly more wide-ranging reflection on homesickness and nostalgia. There's an observation that intrigued me, which is that Charlemagne's court is a time when we can see a literature of homesickness come into being. This isn't because there was no homesickness before that, but it's because through history, the sort of literary forms that people have to express certain feelings in don't always exist the same way at different times. And the combination of the foreigners who came to Charlemagne's court, but also the insular Peregrini, the Irish and the Anglo-Saxons who went to the continent for religious reasons and wrote home reflecting on their experience, means there's suddenly a sort of density of literary expressions of homesickness that wasn't there before, not because people didn't feel homesickness. So I'm going to start with some sort of general observations and then give you some cameos of instances of homesickness and finish up with the Old English elegies. So we might assume that homesickness is a universal human sentiment. And also, I just want to detour and remind us all that humans are a diasporic species. We would not be here if people had not been going places in small boats ever since the beginning of human existence. That is the nature of human being. And the homesickness we find in literature is not homesickness for an abstract homeland. Only one of the poems I share with you is going to sort of mention a homeland. People didn't really conceive of countries. They conceived of the land of the East Saxons or the land of the Northumbrians or the land of the Franks. And indeed, the literature will reflect the sense that human connection, rather than land and soil, is what provokes the longing and the grief. We have to just consider the word nostalgia. I found something about it this morning that fascinated me. So nostalgia comes from the Greek word nostos, the homeward journey. Odysseus's long journey, longing for home, suffering, is the nostos, and algos, the word for pain. But the word wasn't coined as an English word until a doctor who was traveling with Swiss mercenaries, a medical student in the 17th century in 1688, needed a name for melancholy, almost like illness that they suffered from. This really struck me. It was the homesickness of warriors. We're going to come back to warriors. Nostalgia now is a sort of rose-tinted word that we might stir together with hygge and think of candles and blankets and cocoa at home. But this idea that the pain of longing for home or the people of home can be so acute that it makes you ill, I think it's part of the world of literary truth that we need to remember, that visceral human connections are kind of the nourishment of our soul. And so the pain of homesickness is not something to be trivialized, even though it's something that human beings have chosen all along. Homesickness as a medical condition for Swiss warriors, Heimweh, homesickness. So we need to really give these emotions their full gravity, just the way in ballads people die of heartbreak, and in real life people have to go to school the next day. Nonetheless, there is a truth in the ballads. And this is a kind of pain that's intrinsic to the human condition of moving away and doing different things. So now I want to move on and give some examples from the Peregrini and Alcuin. And they had this special opportunity to articulate these feelings of longing because they were traveling and because they were writing to their audience back home. So not migrating as a family, but as we'll see in the Boniface example, one woman who went abroad to the continent to being a missionary, longing to see her brother's face before they both died. So these expressions of homesickness that I'm going to share for you, except for one, are almost always longing for a beloved person or persons or a community, not attachment to the land or the cozy blankets or a nation. So now I'm going to share some of these examples. The first one I'm going to share is a slightly exceptional one by an Irishman in the 9th century who was sort of steeped in Virgil. So this is the closest we get to the green, green grass of home, not I miss you, Mom. So an Irishman, the Irish had a habit of going abroad as missionaries, and they considered this missionary experience to be almost like martyrdom. It was like a lower degree of martyrdom because of the pain of leaving the homeland. And this is by itself, this is a really interesting insight into that depth of attachment. So Coleman, the old man who's been on the continent for a while, writes to a young man who happens to have the same name. He's writing a blessing to wish him a safe journey. He says that he would make the same journey if he's younger, but they're acknowledging that the younger Coleman had failed in his martyr-like commitment to be a missionary on the continent. This is Helen Waddell's translation, and although her translations can seem a bit dated, they are still in some ways a gold standard for fully infusing these poems with their human depth. So this is Coleman's Farewell to Coleman from medieval Latin lyrics. So since your heart is set on those sweet fields and you must leave me here, swift be your going, heed not any prayers, although the voice be dear. Vanquished you are by love of thy own land. That is the word patria. That's very unusual in this context. And who shall hinder love? Why should I blame thee for thy weariness and try thy heart to move? If Christ would but give me back the past and that first strength of days, and this white head of mine were dark-haired again, I too might go your ways. Go thou, my son, swift be thy cleaving prow, and do not quite forget. Here, my son, little have I to say. Let the world's pomp go by. Swift it is as wind, an idle dream, smoke in an empty sky. Go to the land whose love gives thee no rest, and may Almighty God, hope of our life, Lord of the sea, of winds and waters, Lord, give thee safe passage on the wrinkled sea. Bring thee through mist and foam to thy desire, again to Irish land. I've shortened that a bit. So that's quite extraordinary, and that's actually exceptional compared to the others I'm going to look at. Now we're going to move to a woman from the circle of Boniface in the 8th century. And these are extracts from letters that survive in one single manuscript on the continent. They were first really brought to attention by Peter Dronke in his amazing book, Women Writers of the Middle Ages, which I commend to everyone. And Dronke emphasized this sort of commonality of sentiment between this letter, which we have every reason to believe is genuine, and Old English poems like The Wife's Lament. So this missionary, Bertgith, is somewhere in Germany, likely but not necessarily Bavaria, longing to see her brother before she dies, and I'll share a few extracts from her. Why is it, my brother, that you have let pass so long a time, that you have delayed to come? Do you not want to remember that I am alone upon this earth, and no other brother will visit me, or any kinsman come to me? Oh, my brother, how can you afflict the mind of me with constant grief, weeping, and sorrow day and night through the absence of your love? Do you not know for sure that among all the living there is none whom I set higher than your love? Look, I can't suggest all this to you by letter. I feel certain you don't care about me, who am not. And then she goes on and says, my soul is weary of life, languishing for our fraternal love. I am alone, abandoned, deprived of the help of kindred, for my mother and father have left me, but the Lord has taken me. True love is never broken by severance of place, and yet I tell you that sorrow has never receded from my souls. Even in dreams I am restless. Love is as strong as death. And there's more to read from her letters, and those, again, are just an extraordinary, vivid, and heartfelt document. You can wear their shoes, we can also inhabit their sense of longing, and that picture of the life lived continuously with grief for the brother, even though this woman had been so brave and gone to the continent to be a missionary for Boniface, is really remarkable. Reading it out loud almost makes me feel too sentimental, because it just becomes real. That sense, though, that the love is there always, but also that she's longing for a Lord we're going to return to. So the homesickness is this longing for human connection and family connection, that isn't negated and isn't sundered by the deep religious faith. It's a both and of continual sorrow. I'm moving on quite quickly. If anyone wants, if you have a question or a comment, do wave your hand. I'm going to move now to the beginning of the 8th century, not to the world of the Peregrini, but to something that's always struck me as just very strange, but also kind of ultimate encapsulation of the early English world. So this is the journey of the Abbot Ceolfrith of Wearmouth Jarrow. Ceolfrith sponsored a project of Wearmouth Jarrow of making 3 great single-volume Bibles, one each for each of the 2 monasteries, Wearmouth and Jarrow, and one to be given as a gift to the Pope. And in 716, he had all his monks ready and ships. And no journey was just like 2 men and a horse. A journey like this was like a major delegation. So he had something like 80 people ready to go on this mission. And he announced to his monks at the last minute, "I too am going with the books. Bye, guys." At this point, he was well on in years, and they knew they might never see him again. And indeed, he died on the journey. And I want to read a little bit about his death and then what happened to the monks who were accompanying him. So, he reached the lands of Gaul and was magnificently honored even by King Chilperic. And then he reached the town of Langres in Burgundy on September 25th, a Friday, where, worn out with years and a lengthy illness, he grew weak in a good old age, as the scriptures put it, and was laid with his fathers. He was 74, had been a priest for 47 years, and ruled by himself as abbot for 35. So he died there. And when your text tells you he'd had a lengthy illness, I'm sure that means he'd been ill well before he set out. There's a common feature that when monks lose an abbot, people talk as if they're orphaned. Alcuin talked about feeling orphaned when his teacher died. So he died. He'd had 80 men who'd followed him and were devoted to him as if he were their father. And he'd been like full of charity and giving food to the hungry for his whole life. We have a sort of kind of biographical excursus on his virtues, especially of charity. And then, because he died abroad, he was buried abroad, and there's an account of that. And so with their father buried, some of the brothers who had brought him there returned to their native land to relate in his monastery where and when he had departed the body. Some continued on the planned journey to Rome to deliver the gifts he had sent. The gifts include that Bible. But some, in fact, preferred to stay in the town of Langres where he had died because of their love for their parent buried there. Afterwards, they did fulfill their intended desire to go to Rome. And then the sort of lord of the region fed them and put them up and took care of them for as long as they wished to remain. This isn't meant to be trivializing, but I can't help but think of Greyfriars Bobby, or the sort of trope of the dog on the grave of the human. This is a sort of visceral attachment to the death place in the body of the beloved abbot. This is a remarkable story. So this isn't quite homesickness per se, but it's kind of giving us a glimpse of this intellectual world of the intense attachments and the idea that the place of burial of the beloved abbot father would become a home where people would want to stay. So in that also brings us back to the idea of homesickness, is this lack of community, being distant from the brother, even though Berkith was in a religious community, the beloved abbot father dying, and some people wanting to be with his dead body rather than the community of the living. This is visceral stuff, and I think in different ways, these are the sort of texts that if you reread them through your life after different kinds of loss and experience, you understand more how deeply they're giving us a window into experience and feeling of the past. I'm now going to move on to Alcuin, and really now I just want to sort of give us three little snapshots of concepts of homesickness in his writings. So Alcuin was raised in York, which was the preeminent center of learning of the time, surpassing Italy and the continent. His center of activity was less than a mile from where we are now, which is very wonderful. He was basically headhunted by Charlemagne. He's a noble person. We can know about his experiences of friendship and grief, even if we don't know where he was at a particular time. We do not know the day he went to the continent. We know a great deal about his ongoing connection to York, because once he was separated from York, he had to write home. Indeed, if he'd stayed in York, he and his teacher in the School of York might be completely unknown because of the Viking destruction of records, and because he wouldn't have been invited to write school books for people on the continent who had a less high standard of education than the School of York. So why did Alcuin stay with Charlemagne? Why did he never come back? This is an extremely interesting question. Reading between the lines of his letters, we can see that in about 796 he was invited back to be present at the election of a new archbishop, perhaps even to become the new archbishop. The letters about this are short. For example, there's one, someone came from York to the continent and said, he writes a letter back saying, like, I got here safely and I have relayed your message, or at least as much as I could remember. You can imagine everyone groaning. But just to have that testimony is remarkable. So by the 790s, Alcuin was retiring. He was given the monastery of Tours, it was almost like having your own private printing press, because it was so wealthy, and he could have a whole team of people copying books. Students came there to study with him. Charlemagne was going from strength to strength, while Northumbria was falling into violence, corruption, and tyranny. So it's quite easy to understand why he might feel that he sort of had more opportunities in Northumbria. The strongest hint of this is the letter where he keeps reminding his successor that the books are his, and arranges to have, we don't really know whether he exported the books or sent people to copy them. That's a puzzle that can't be solved, but it's an interesting puzzle. So this is a letter from that time where we almost sense he's trying to sort of express his deepest love for the community he left behind. And again, I'm just going to read extracts. People who were given to religious communities as children perhaps didn't always experience the trauma we might think they did, because they could be received into an incredibly loving environment. And Alcuin remembered his teacher, Albert, as being a sort of outstanding, gentle guide and mentor. So he writes to the brothers of the Church of York. My heart is filled to overflowing with the sweetness of your love, and my affection increases daily if a full heart can grow fuller. You tended the impressionable years of my infancy with motherly affection, and upheld me in the wanton period of boyhood. Wanton boys at York, Alcuin would write to people at York saying, don't let the boys go fox hunting. With holy patience, what more can I do than pray for the eternal goodness of the great King to reward you for all your services to me with great blessing. This I do continually, not ceasing to pour out before the Most High the secret tears of my longing, wherever my restless path takes me to the holy places of martyrs and confessors. I beseech you, have me, Alcuin, always in your hearts and on your lips in the hours of common prayer and in your private prayer. You too, who are my sons in age, but fathers in holiness, I beg you never to forget the master who taught you. He goes on, I do not believe I can be blamed for any learning you may not have acquired, nor will my concern for your progress cease. I am with you still. Dearest fathers and brothers, remember that I am yours, whether in life or death. Perhaps God will pity me so that you may bury the child you taught when he is old. But if another place is assigned to my body, I believe my soul will be granted peace with you by God's grace through your prayers, whatever its place is to be. For I believe that the souls of our brotherhood must be reunited in heaven, as in our boy Seneca's vision. Be strong-minded, master these transitory things, that you may win your way to the beloved country of heavenly glory, divine grace everywhere going before and after. So in a way, the real longing for home is this shared heavenly homeland. And this is the radical perspective of all medieval Christians, that this world is transitory. The true homeland is heaven. I think, was it Augustine or Caesarius of Arles said that the scriptures were like a letter from home, a letter from heaven calling people back. So this is a sort of radical revalorizing of the concept of home. Is home a place? Is home the blankets and sheets and candles? Is home the people, or is home the heavenly community? And this concept that home is that community is sort of intrinsic to these medieval concepts of longing and nostalgia. Alcuin wrote a long poem about York, which is amazing. And interestingly, we have some echoes of thoughts about home there. So he talks about how York was the haven for ocean-going ships, where the sailor would at last be happy tying his ship up at home. Alcuin talks about diverse people, humans, the diasporic species, coming to York in hope of gain, seeking wealth from the land, a home, a fortune, and a hearthstone for themselves. York is a place to make a home. But that sea journey is also the image for his poem. So at the start of the poem, he says, like, I'm going to embark on a sea journey. And then at the very end of the poem, he says, like a rough sailor with these goods loaded on my fragile bark, sailing through the ocean waves and hidden shallows, I have brought them back as I should to the port of York, which reared me as its foster son, wisely training me from my earliest years. For you I have written this rustic poem about its bishops, kings, and saints. I beseech those saints whom I have mentioned to guide my light vessel from the sea of the world to the port of life. So there's a sort of interweaving of the poem itself is a sea journey. Alcuin makes a sea journey. Life is a sea journey. York is the port. But ultimately the sort of safe port is heaven. And now that brings me, how are we doing on time? Yeah, so that brings me to the last text I wanted to touch on, which you may have guessed because I'm talking about sea journeys, are the Old English poems, The Wanderer and the Seafarer, written, surviving in a manuscript circa 1000, so later than Alcuin. It's easy when you first read these poems to think like these are the true breath of the vernacular north and the smoke in the houses and the sea. But actually, these poems are deeply imbued with patristic thought. And this idea that there's a sort of kind of essence of thought and concepts based on Latin, patristic, or Mediterranean learning, clothed in this amazing Anglo-Saxon language about weather and cold is, again, one of the reasons that we should just never be condescending about any relics of the past. Not a shoe, not a piece of thread, not a poem. Kind of, there's so much full human experience here. So I'm just gonna, just to finish off now, I'm just gonna, 2 minutes? Yeah, that's okay. So we're just gonna do one passage from each. Oft it showed Anna utna ya wilcha min cara quithan nisnu quikranan they at chimmod sefan minadura swelt to la sejan. Often I alone had to speak of my trouble each morning before the dawn. There is now no one living to whom I clearly dare speak my innermost thoughts. For thon what say they shall, his win a dreetnas laufas larquidum longa for tholion, thona sorg on sloth somod at gadra ermna anhogan oft yubindath. And so he knows it who must forgo for a long time the counsels of his beloved Lord, and sorrow and sleep both together tie up the wretched solitary one. Thon onweknend ef winna lasguma, ye seeth him before and fail away, gas bathian brimfuglas, breathe and feather, house and hrim on snow, herle yamenged. Then the friendless man wakes again. He sees before him the fallow waves, seabirds bathe, preening their feathers, frost and snowfall mixed with hail. Sorrow is renewed when the mind surveys the memory of kinsmen. He greets them joyfully. There's so much wonderful material in here. People have often said these poems have an amazing resonance with the experience of depression, a sense of waking early, seeing these seabirds, being aware of desolation. That was the wanderer, the seafarer. We're just going to take one tiny passage, and then I think I'll still finish on time. So the seafarer has a more emphasis on this resolution of finding grace, and there is this home if you dismiss the transitory world. This the man does not know, for whom on land it turns out favorably, how I, wretched and sorrowful, on the ice-cold sea dwelt for a winter in the paths of exile, bereft of friendly kinsmen, hung about with icicles, hail fell in showers, I heard nothing but the roaring sea. Hal shorum flair varich na hurda boot on him man say. Ut on way hidjan, whar way ham again, on dhama yish you think can, who way through kumen, and way dhona actilion, that way to moten in the etchan ea dignissa. Thar is leaf you long in lufandreutness. Let us ponder where we have our homes, whar way ham ayen, and then think how we get thither, how we all strive that we might go there to the eternal blessedness that is a belonging life in the love of the Lord, joy in heaven. So that was the seafarer. So that was some scattered thoughts on home and homesickness, and I hope as you walk in your shoes and use your textiles, this enables you kind of to touch the common humanity besides the material culture, but the fact that we all share these deep human experiences.